I think there's a coffee commercial. Maybe it's a Maxwell House commercial where the guy is sitting there, realizes that, he's in the Zoom meeting and realizes that the camera is a little too low. And so he holds up the coffee cup in front of the camera. Jeffrey Toobin was holding up something else.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 281. Joining me again this week, the pistol-packing padre himself, John Bennett. Pastor, welcome back.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's always fun to do this.
It is. It's even more fun when you've got Old Smoky Tennessee moonshine.
As much as we talk about that stuff on the show, I know it's listener-funded, but we should get sponsorships from Old Smoky.
We really should. I need to send them an email. Today, we are talking about a subject that will drive you to drink, a subject that has a lot of tongues wagging this week, abortion. And why are we talking about abortion on a pro-gun show? Well, you will find out here shortly. But first, I do want to thank the men and women who make this show possible, the members of the Reformation Gun Club. I am so honored to have all these great people supporting the show. We had a big switch, a big turnover. Almost exactly a year ago, we got away from Patreon and some of the funding sites and moved to our own website, and almost everyone moved along with us. And the first anniversary came around, and I was concerned that there would be some turnover in membership, and every single person who was more than half the members who were scheduled to renew their memberships just this week, and all of them did. I am so honored and grateful for that. We are a listener-funded podcast, and that means we don't have any advertising. We don't have any sponsorships. We rely on these good people to keep our show going. And this week, I want to give a shout-out to Eric from Buckeye, Ohio, Frank from Lake City, Michigan, John from Spokane, Washington, Tony from Little Elm, Texas, Vincent from Tulare, California, and our good friend Calroy from Boron, California. Thank you all for your support. We really do appreciate it. If you would like to find out more about the Reformation Gun Club, all the benefits and all the good stuff that's available, and help support the show for as little as $1 a month, check out armedlutheran.us/gun club, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right. So I've been thinking about this subject for a while, actually, trying to figure out a way to broach the subject. And this week, the Supreme Court gave us, and the legislature of Texas gave us the impetus to go ahead and jump into this. The Supreme Court failed to step in to stop, so far, a new Texas law that protects the unborn after a fetal heartbeat can be detected. So, talking heads in the media, of course, and entertainment have decided that preventing women from killing their unborn children is just like the Taliban or something. Or I think somebody even compared it to the Runaway Slave Act. Logic for leftists is not a strong subject, as you probably have heard on this show before. Did you see Bette Midler, even, who is the noted ethicist on The View, as you know? She even suggested that women should refuse to have sex with men to protest the law, and it's the first time, I think, ever that anyone on the left has actually promoted abstinence. It's an amazing thing.
Well, if we could get liberals to stop having sex...
Just...
If liberals weren't procreating and weren't reproducing, that would be a wonderful thing.
That would work out over time, absolutely.
As long as they weren't using abortion as a means of birth control, I'm all for it.
Which is what all too often happens. So we have been over the years criticized by those who say we talk a little too much about abortion. We should focus on the gun issues. So why do we talk about abortion so much? How is the subject of abortion and the subject of gun rights linked? Pastor, first initial thoughts on that question?
Well, I would say that the fundamental right to life exists for those on both sides of the womb. That how can you be for the natural right to self-defense, which exists for the purpose of protecting the sanctity of life? How can you be supportive of that and not be supportive of protecting the sanctity of life for those who are the most vulnerable, those who have not yet been born? I think perhaps the most heinous thing that I heard this past week was, and I don't even remember who it was some disdainful person whose name should be stricken from history forever because it's just horrible. But this person, and it was a man, going on and on about how this means that there's going to be a whole lot more people born who are Down syndrome or have other disabilities.
Gee whiz.
And clearly this piece of human excrement has never interacted with someone who has Down syndrome, because for some reason, people speak of Down syndrome as if it's this horrible thing. But if you have ever interacted with somebody who has Down syndrome, they are some of the kindest people you will ever meet, who don't even have the ability to be unkind to others. Mm-hmm. It is truly an amazing phenomenon. And yet this piece of garbage was lamenting how more people in Texas are going to be born who have Down syndrome. Honestly, I think the world needs more people with Down syndrome, especially in places like Iceland, where they were bragging a few years ago of how they've completely eradicated Down syndrome from their little nation.
I was just going to bring that up because wasn't it last year, or was it 2019 before everything descended into chaos with the pandemic, where Iceland made this triumphant announcement that they had basically eradicated Down syndrome. What they didn't say was we eradicated it by killing all the Down syndrome children before they're born.
Yes, it was kind of like eradicating Down syndrome the same way that Adolf Hitler tried to eradicate Judaism.
Yes. We've gotten rid of all the homosexuals and the gypsies and the Jews in Germany. We've cured every one of these ills, by killing them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing how history repeats itself.
It's also very ironic how all the people who support abortion have already been born.
Right. Exactly. And you said the guy who was talking about Down syndrome in Texas was a man? I thought men were...
It was a man, there was a man talking about...
I thought men weren't supposed to speak about these issues.
Right, that's exactly what Jen Psaki said to some reporter for a Catholic newspaper who was asking how Biden, a Catholic, can support abortion when it's against the teachings of the church. And basically, this babbling, rambling buffoon proceeded to tell the man how, because he was a man, he didn't have the right to speak about such things. Yet Biden comments on these things, and he doesn't have a
that we know of
either. And it's funny how all of a sudden that someone on the left was caring about the distinction, but the biological distinction between a man and a woman.
That's true too. It's amazing the inconsistencies on the left when men can have babies and men can breastfeed and women are men and men are women. There's no distinction. There's 57 flavors of gender, but we've got to protect women's sports, and abortion hurts women, and only women can talk about the issue of abortion. Well, what about the other 56? We know the men can't speak about it. So what about the other 55 genders? Are they able to speak on this?
Right.
It's just...
I guess depends on whether or not their hair is dyed some unnatural color.
Right. Depends on your hair color today. So gun rights, and we've said this in the past, gun rights are a pro-life issue. So the two are inexorably linked together. And the idea of gun rights and the idea of ultimately the idea of defending life, pro-life, comes from our understanding of the Fifth Commandment, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are created in God's image. Therefore, because we are created in God's image, life is precious, and life does not stop being precious because you happen to be on the wrong side of the womb. It's very important to make this distinction. If there was no such thing as the sanctity of life, we could not make a logical, concrete argument for the Second Amendment as it pertains to the right to defend your life and the lives of others against those who would cease to take it. If there was no sanctity of life, then we could all be like John Piper and just have the roll over and die approach.
Right.
But we're not going to do that because we believe life is precious. Now, some may try and point out that there's, a supposed logical fallacy with this, that, well, if you act in self-defense with a firearm, then you aren't upholding the sanctity of life of your attacker. However, it is the attacker who is responsible for the consequences of their violent actions, not the person who takes the lengths to defend their life, even though it be by lethal means.
Right.
At the same time, the person who is defending their life, they aren't pulling the trigger with the intent of killing someone, but rather they're pulling that trigger with the intent of protecting their own life and defending the life of either themselves or a loved one if they're using that firearm in defense of someone else.
When you're talking about self-defense, the consequence of self-defense is not always that the person who's attacking, that the criminal dies, right? So
right.
many, anywhere between 250 and 250,000 and 3 million times a year, estimates range
like
that guns are used for self-defense, and the majority of those cases, there's not a death at the other end. The person who's attacking isn't being killed, but in an abortion, the child dies every single time.
Right. Yeah, and you can make the argument that 2 lives are destroyed in that process. The one thing that's never really mentioned by leftists who support the right to murder the unborn, and I use the term right loosely because it's not a right, but rather it is a perversion of the law. Those who defend this will rarely ever speak of those women who have suffered with depression and who have suffered with the regret for, when they come to the realization that I killed my child.
Mm-hmm.
And, you think about it, 73 million babies murdered in the womb since the passage of Roe v. Wade. And, we look at things like cancer. Perhaps we already killed the person who would have found the cure for cancer.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about how the Social Security system is crumbling because the birth rate is so much lower than it was in times past. Well, hello, if we would simply allow children the right to live, then perhaps we would have more taxpayers who would be able to support these systems, even though, yes, you can make a constitutional, legitimate argument that these systems shouldn't exist in the first place, but, I don't think we're getting away from it anytime soon.
Right.
So there's so many factors that come into this of how we are destroying Western civilization through this abhorrent demonic practice of abortion. We look at the birth rates in our country today where we are at less than replacement levels now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, leftists who believe that we're overpopulated and that humanity should cease to exist altogether, they're probably celebrating about this. But the other irony too, we're talking about ironies here, that we have these people who are all about pushing population control and saying that, humanity needs to become extinct so that the planet can thrive and survive. I don't see them volunteering to remove themselves from the equation.
Right. You first.
So clearly they don't, clearly they don't believe in what they're touting. Otherwise they would become a statistic, a suicide statistic, voluntarily. So,
yep.
Yeah.
And getting back to the Fifth Commandment issue, for those who don't know who are not sure what I'm talking about or who number the commandments differently, in Lutheranism, Catholicism, the Fifth Commandment is "Thou shalt not murder." And you say, well, okay, so you shouldn't commit crime, you shouldn't kill somebody, you shouldn't murder somebody. You should also not murder your unborn child. Simply to make your life more, to remove a responsibility from your life so that you can go on and do whatever you want. But there's also the Fifth Commandment, the side of the Fifth Commandment where that we've talked about many times, which is with all of the commandments, there's more to it than just the thou shalt and the thou shalt nots. In addition to not, commanding us not to murder people, we should also not stand by and allow other people to be murdered or harmed if we can do something about it. And in the case of self-defense, when it comes to the ownership of a firearm, you have the ability to prevent harm from being done to yourself or to your family or to your neighbor. In the case of abortion, based on your vote, you have a way, you have an obligation to protect your unborn neighbor.
Right. And we also, I think it's important to make the distinction that we are not supportive of those who use violence against abortion facilities and abortion doctors. That's happened in the past where some nut job who believed in the sanctity of life. Yeah, it's great that you believe in the sanctity of life, but that means not taking the life of someone who is performing these abortions.
And what this comes down to once you've outlined it this way, what it leaves the pro-abortion crowd with is the argument that abortion is not murder because it's not a human life, which is rich, coming from the same people who say that there are not men and women, that there are 57 genders, but at the same time we should follow the science. This is an amazingly anti-science position.
Right. Yeah. The study that was, or there was a research study, a paper of some sort published sometime last year, I believe it was, and it was a consortium of biologists, OBGYNs, we could use the term scientists, who studied the area of life, the origins of life, and so forth. And the consensus, I believe it was 96% of the scientists who responded to the survey concluded that life begins at conception. Mm-hmm. Even though something like 89% of these people consider themselves to be pro-choice. So imagine that for a moment, believing that life begins at conception, but believing that it is acceptable to destroy that life.
Right. And so the way you get around that is to do what President Biden did this week, which was to declare that he doesn't agree with the idea that life begins at conception, despite the science that says it does.
Right. Despite the science, despite the church in which he holds membership declaring that it begins at conception. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to dismiss these things as being moral or acceptable if you deny the reality behind it. Okay, so then life just doesn't begin at conception, so then it must be okay to destroy it.
Right. Well, it has no value then.
Yes, and the most despicable thing, and this is perhaps one of the greatest arguments against the practice of abortion, that a woman who has struggled with problems of infertility suddenly becomes pregnant. And she desires to have that child, and yet through either a medical problem or an injury, she has a miscarriage. And the talk is how tragic it was that she lost this child. Mm-hmm. Yet if she had just had an abortion, no one would have said anything about it.
Right.
that we determine whether or not that is a child in a human life based on whether or not the mother desires that child. It's truly distasteful and wicked.
Yeah, because if we're placing our own personal subjective value on life, then there is no objective value. And so
Absolutely,
how can you judge that if everybody's free to make their own judgment, then how do you say that the elderly person in a nursing home or the elderly person who is in hospice or in respite care, that their life has any value? Why shouldn't we just snuff them out? What about,
Right.
and this is where how you get to the decision that we talked about earlier in Iceland, where, and the idiot who was talking about, Down syndrome children being born, the idea that we place a value on life because we don't believe personally that it has any value, because we just can't see ourselves raising one of those children or caring for one of those people. So it would make more sense. It would be more compassionate just to get rid of them. That's where, and that's a really dangerous way to think about life. If there's no objective value to it, there's a way you can make life at any stage worthless.
Precisely, and that's one of the problems that those who support abortion need to grapple with, is that if it is okay to end a life because it is either inconvenient or unwanted, then why is that not applied universally? Now, thank God it's not applied universally, but imagine how that would play out, that, well, my boss is making my life miserable. My life would be a whole lot easier if I just made him disappear.
Right.
But where, and people will try to use arguments like consciousness and viability.
Mm-hmm.
So then take that to the next step. As you mentioned, those in nursing homes, well, they're not really viable. They're not really contributing to society. And then you end up with the kind of world that you see portrayed in the film Soylent Green.
Or Logan's Run.
Right. And I do want to say this, on the off chance that there is anyone listening who has had a loved one who has had an abortion, or perhaps any of our listeners who themselves have had an abortion and you've struggled with that. Yes, Lloyd, you and I believe that this is a sin, that this is a practice that is contrary to God's word and contrary to God's will. At the same time, this does not mean that there is not forgiveness for that.
Right.
And know that the blood of Christ covers that sin as well. That if that happens to be you, know that you are forgiven. Know that your life is precious in the eyes of the Savior.
Absolutely. There's also a constitutional distinction to make here. One last thought. The Constitution protects the right to life and liberty, but abortion destroys both. And you own a gun to defend life and liberty. It's an interesting distinction between the two, and yet somehow it is suggested that the Constitution protects the quote-unquote right to abortion.
Right. Well, and I think one of the most horrible terms that has come into existence in recent history is the term reproductive rights.
Mm.
I would not want to force anyone to reproduce, because that would be a case of rape.
Right.
Reproductive rights, the act of reproduction has taken place because you had intercourse. Now, if that was not consensual, do I still believe abortion is wrong in those instances? Absolutely. Are you forgiven if you made that choice after becoming pregnant following a rape? Know that there is forgiveness. But the act of reproduction has already taken place.
Mm-hmm.
We want people to be responsible about the choices that they have made. I think one of the most shallow arguments that's made is, well, what if people can't afford birth control and those sorts of things? There was a time where my wife, due to medical reasons, had to be on birth control. It was not covered by insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any guesses as to what a month's supply of orthotricycline cost, a generic from Walmart?
It's about, what, $12-15?
I think it was $9.51 to be exact.
Yeah.
So if you can't afford $9.51 a month, you're too poor to be having sex.
Yes, absolutely.
So if you acted irresponsibly, do not make your child the product of your reproductive act of intercourse. Be the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Be responsible. Step up. Take care of that which is flesh of your flesh, which is bone of your bone, which is not, people say, well, don't tell women what to do with your body. But this is a separate individual. Simply because this individual, created in the image of God, happens to have taken up residence in the mother's womb, does not mean the mother then has the right to snuff out that life that has been created, that is a gift from God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The my body, my choice thing just means that you have a right to have sex. Whether you should or not is another matter. You have a right, at the same time, you have a right to own a gun, right? Again, right. Whether you should or not, a completely different matter, but you have the right. Those choices are up to you. But once you've made that choice, there are responsibilities and consequences that you have to live with. If you misuse a firearm, someone could die. You should pay the price for that. If you get pregnant because for some reason you thought killing your unborn child was less, or you think that killing your unborn child is not as bad as paying $9 a month for birth control, there's a responsibility that comes with that, and you're making someone else pay for it. My body, my choice doesn't mean you have the right to murder.
Right. And there's, I put, we've talked a lot about the choice of the individual, but I think that there also bears a lot of responsibility on the part of society as well. We're still giving to the tune of roughly $500 million tax dollars a year to Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of young women who have been convinced either by people who work for Planned Parenthood or other agencies that, well, this is inconvenient. You can't afford to become a mother right now. What instead if we provided, we took all that money away from Planned Parenthood and we instead provided incentives for women to actually carry that child to term?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Instead of society telling them that this is a burden that's going to ruin your life.
Right.
Why not?
There's something like 32 families waiting to adopt every child that's given up to adoption.
Mm.
It's a 32 to 1 I think it's 32. A 32 to 1 ratio of parents who want, or not parents, but couples who want to adopt versus available infants for adoption. So, this is a gift that a mother could give to someone else. So why don't we say, okay, we're going to provide for all of your medical care. We're going to provide for, perhaps there could be some rent assistance in there for you as you can't work through part of the pregnancy and so forth. There has to be a way to provide for these women so that there is encouragement as well as an incentive there for them to carry that child to term.
Yep. Well, and I think we know why that we don't provide those incentives, because giving that money to Planned Parenthood is a way of laundering it, so it ends up back in the pockets of politicians.
Right.
It's really what it comes down to. The money that could be spent, or that is laundered through groups like Planned Parenthood, is more important than actually protecting human life.
Right. Yeah. It's roughly 50 cents of the dollar of every tax dollar that goes to Planned Parenthood ends up going to fund Democrat candidates for public office.
Yep. Now, the other distinction, getting back to the Constitution, is that the right to bear arms is actually enshrined in black and white in the Bill of Rights, right? Shall not be infringed. The quote-unquote right to abortion was created out of whole cloth in 1973 by 7 justices, led by, was it Justice Harry Blackmun at the time?
I believe so, yeah.
found the right to an abortion in the penumbra of the Constitution. Now, for those who are not familiar with that term, a penumbra is a term used to refer to the part of a solar eclipse where it's just the part where it's just getting shady on the edge, but the sun is still partly visible. So basically, the idea of the penumbra of the Constitution, this is a progressive concept that rights can be extended by inference based on other rights that are expressly covered in the Constitution. So they extrapolate the right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness with sex without consequence, and voila, they extend the non-existent right to abortion.
Right. Well, and they've been even more devious than that, because they claim that this is enshrined within the constitutional right to privacy, but yet there is no phrase within the Constitution that guarantees a right to privacy. Yep. If we truly did have a right to privacy, the NSA would be non-existent by now.
Right. Somebody would have sued them. It's the same thinking that drove, what was it, the Obergefell ruling, the gay marriage ruling that made marriage a right. So what was originally the original idea I had for this, turning over in my head for this show, was the idea of single issue voters. So the people who base their votes particularly for candidates on a single issue like gun rights. And for some people, that Second Amendment issue is the paramount issue, even over and above the issue of life, which I think is where the criticism we get about talking about abortion so much comes from. So how do you balance? Obviously, there's more than just gun rights and pro-life issues. We're never going to get somebody who is both 100% pro-life and Roe versus Wade, criminalize abortion, and somebody who is 100% pro-2A, abolish the ATF and in the NFA kind of guy. So how do we balance those issues when it comes to deciding on candidates? Is abortion and the Second Amendment, are they sufficient litmus tests for how we judge a candidate? How do you balance the two?
I would say generally yes, but at the same time, one of the criticisms that we have been making since the start of Clinging to God and Guns is how so many on the left make their, and by this I mean those who are Christians and yet are leftists, is that they make their politics their primary religion. Mm. And we need to make sure that we aren't falling into that same trap. For instance, if you have two choices and you have a pro-life Democrat, yes, there are pro-life Democrats out there, even though it seems like it's a unicorn. But yes, there are pro-life Democrats out there. If you had a pro-life Democrat who perhaps was rather squishy on the Second Amendment versus a Republican who was more pro-choice and yet very solid on the Second Amendment, as a Christian, which one ought you vote for? Now, I'm creating the hypothetical that more than likely will never exist in reality, but this is a good debate to have, if you will, that if we believe that we are created in the image of God, then the question of abortion should be an automatic, no, I reject this, because this is contrary to God's work as the creator of life. Where this plays into the Second Amendment then is yes, if we understand the Second Amendment as giving us the lawful tools, if you will, to protect life after the point of birth, then that is certainly something that we should be focused on as Christians, that this too is part of the sanctity of life argument. But there should be no differentiation between the two. There should be no differentiation between the right to life based on which side of the womb a person happens to be on.
Right. Yeah. And to me, if you're I mean, obviously there are more issues to consider, but if a candidate's willing to take away your right to own a gun, they can't be trusted with other of your rights. And if they can't be trusted to protect the lives of the unborn, you certainly can't trust them to protect those who are already born either. I mean, look at Afghanistan recently as a perfect example.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it probably goes without saying, but I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule. But in general, the person who, or I should say the person seeking public office who supports the Second Amendment, more likely than not, they're also going to be a strong supporter of the right to life.
Right.
So it'd be a snowball's chance in Death Valley that we'd ever have to be faced with that decision between a pro-life Democrat versus a pro-gun Republican who also happened to be, the right to choice, which is, supporting the right to the death of the unborn. Let's call it what it is.
Right.
But we should always, fall on the side of the sanctity of life, regardless of what side of the womb a person happens to be on.
Here's a hypothetical for you that is, I think, more likely. What if, we tend to play the whole who's wearing my jersey thing, right? Are they on my team or are they on the other team? If they're on the other team, then I'm not going to vote for them. And I agree that we should be open to the idea of voting across the aisle. If you're a registered Democrat and the person who is a Republican in the particular race you're considering happens to align more closely with your values, that's the person you should vote for, and vice versa. But what if the situation arises, the unlikely unicorn arises, that you have that pro-life, pro-gun Democrat or the pro-life, pro-gun Republican? Let's take it. No, let's not do the other flip. Let's say you have the pro-life, pro-gun Democrat, but we know that the Democrat Party in general, that the power structure of the party is anti-gun and pro-death, pro-abortion. Can you, and your choice is vote for the pro-gun, pro-life Democrat, thereby giving more power to Democrats in Congress in terms of numbers, or vote for the Republican who may be a little squishy on those issues. How do you balance that?
For me, from my perspective, both the best thing politically speaking, as well as the best thing morally, religiously speaking, would be to vote for the person who is pro-life, pro-gun, even if they happen to be on the other side of the aisle politically. Again, that's more than likely going to be a unicorn when we look to see, how absolutely insane the Democrat Party has been, where men can use women's bathrooms and so forth.
Right.
But think of it in this way: how good would it be then for someone who stands up for these principles to be in the party and influencing the thought processes and the philosophy of that pro-death party? If we could say that this person would perhaps bring a little bit of sanity to a thoroughly morally depraved party, would that not be a good thing? Yes, you can look at it from the whole power struggle structure of it, but look at guys like John McCain, who so often voted with Democrats just to stick it to Republicans that he didn't like, such as Donald Trump. He was the vote to maintain Obamacare. He came back to D.C. from dying of cancer just so that he can be the deciding vote on to protect Obamacare because Trump was trying to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Play the long game, right? Instead of worrying about, okay, we know this party is more pro-life and this party is less pro-life or whatever, and playing that for the current election cycle. I like the idea that, okay, vote for the mole. Vote for the person in the other party who stands out, who is different, who supports your values, and hopefully over time that person more likely they're going to flame out and just quit. But the chances of, if we don't at least try, that party is never going to change.
Right.
And if there's nobody on that side who's going to make the pro-life and the pro-gun argument, then we're going to be constantly in this battle for the right to life and the right to defend our lives. And that's never going to change.
No, and I mean, sadly, reality, I don't think it's going to change until Jesus comes back, but let's hope that comes soon, because it seems like the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket.
Yes. Hell on a pogo stick, as my grandpa always said. All right, I think that wraps it up, folks. If you have any thoughts or any comments, we would love to hear them. Please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail or a voice message. We would love to hear from you and respond directly or in a future episode. Pastor, thank you so much for doing this. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely, I did as well.
And folks, be sure to tune in next week, episode 282. We'll have another variety show with content from the entire cast. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.